speaker I'd like to introduce is Charles Ince. And Charles is from GNIP, which is a data vendor who we rely on at the Health Media Laboratory for our data. And he's launching the day with a discussion about data sources, which is where it all begins. So I think we'll have a lecture from Charles.
Everyone, I think we're just going to wait for this to pop up here.
No, it's fine.
So I'm from GNIP. We're based in Boulder, Colorado. My name is Charles Ince. I'm going to tell you a little bit about social data. I thought I would start with the social data ecosystem, which is sort of our term for describing the dynamics about how things sort of exist. What we're seeing in this case with social data is there's lots of applications. In our world, we see use cases ranging across the spectrum, but I think today, as I walk through some of the elements of the social data ecosystem and how things sort of work, I think it'll be pretty clear the various ways that, that social data can be used in terms of public health. So some of our beliefs at GNIP, we believe that social data has a limited value and near limitless applications. And so we're talking about social data. It's being generated from lots of different networks. There's all kinds of different types of social data. There could be a like, a vote, it could be a blog post, a comment. So we have lots of different types of social data. Here's a slide. You can kind of see it. I don't know if you can make it out very well, but this would be a lot of different of the networks kind of grouped together and kind of sorted out in terms of what they're kind of used for. We have a lot of publishing networks that focus on publishing. Those would be kind of like your WordPress, your Tumblr. You have networks that focus on interactions. So from all of this activity going on here, we're generating a lot of data. So anytime something is happening in these networks, these events are being recorded. The networks are using this data to drive their own processes and enhance the user experience. So if they don't have the data, they don't understand how it's working, it's going to be very difficult for them to carry out the day-to-day operations of the network. So obviously the data that's being created in these networks is extremely critical for their own well-being of the network so they know what's going on. The other thing that starts to become interesting about the data is it starts to drive other types of engagement through third-party applications. So the most common integration to a social network will be like if you're going to tweet off your iPhone. So you may have a Twitter native app, or maybe you've downloaded a different app. And so the social networks are seeding this. They're putting the data out there so third parties can come start to work with it and help drive more engagement to their network, right? So if there aren't people talking and there isn't easy ways to access the networks and engage, then we're not going to have the users that are required to generate the network in the first place. The other reason that social data exists, and this is more of where things are growing, and this is where the implications in public health are become really interesting, is actually driving analytics. So aside from the network sustaining itself, this data can also be used in other ways that are really interesting across the spectrum. So this could be, again, public health, this could be disaster response, this could be brand management, and there's a lot of different applications when we start to talk about social data and analytics. When we think about social data and using it, some of the first things we have to kind of ask ourselves, we have to be honest with ourselves, is how are we going to take this data on? What are we going to do with it? What sorts of questions do we want to have answered, right? So if you're looking at building an application that, let's say, monitors the frequency of keywords related to influenza, right? So we're going to look at the frequency of these keywords. We're going to look at the time of the year. Maybe we're going to compare it with some social records, some medical records, and we're going to see if we can't pick up on the discussion in social media across the a social network or even the internet at large. So that's kind of a not easy thing to do, right? Do we have all of the tools to actually execute that? So we have to think a lot about, first of all, things like, what are the time frames to get this done, right? Do I have to build the tools, then get the data, then analyze it, or am I going to kind of do it at once with a solution that already has the text analytics and the mining capabilities already built in? So aside from what decisions you make there, you got to kind of think about the capacity. How much data do I need to really actually drive a valid answer? Am I going to be getting, am I just going to use a small amount of data, and am I going to sort of verify that something exists? Or am I going to go deep, and do I want to actually explore several social networks and then compare that to my medical data, for example? Also, if we're thinking about collecting data, you got to think about the reliability. Is the data going to be there all the way through your study? Could it disappear at the last week just before you're finished, right? So we have to think about, is the data that I'm going to be sampling out of the social network going to be there for me to fulfill all the requirements? And then budget, right? So that's the reality is, are we going to pay for the data? Are we going to pay a service to get the data for us? Do we have budget to actually process the data? So there's a lot of things we have to ask ourselves. And we have to be very honest. Most of these things I've seen in the industry, they're not easy answers to come up with all the time, right? You might go in with one objective, and the time frames actually put you into a different down a different path, right? So we have to be honest with ourselves, but these are the things that we want to think about as we start to solve the use case with social data. So we talked about social data. It's being generated in a lot of different ways in different networks. There's different types of social data. It all has different meanings. But at the end of the day, we've got to get this data. So how are we going to find it? Again, we're going to think about things like reliability. Is it going to be there? Do I care if it's there or not the whole time? Do I just need a little bit? And so there's three main methods that social data can be made available for doing analytics. Probably the most common way that data is made available is through the social network's public APIs. So the social network is going to basically allow the public to come access its data. It's going to be putting out compliant data that meets its terms of service with its users. And this is kind of meant to seed innovation. So this could help maybe someone who wants to build an app. They need a little bit of data, like an iPhone app. They need a little bit of data to make a proof of concept. Maybe someone's looking at doing some analytics. So it's kind of meant to help seed and really infiltrate the market with their data so people can kind of get a new perspective of what's going on. Another way to get data is crawling. And with all these, by the way, as you can see, there's some pros and some cons that you can read it for yourself. I don't mention them, but essentially, if we're going to be crawling data, this is where we're not actually going to be going through a public API. We're going to actually go visit the network, and we're going to look at the information through a bot or some sort of crawling program, and we're going to pull some data out. We're going to hopefully get it structured and organized, and then we'll be able to use that as get these data activities, and basically by walking through the site, if you will. I think there'll be some folks that can speak to more clarity on this. I'm not an expert in this area. The other type of access would be going through a licensed arrangement. So that's actually what we do at GNIP is we actually work with publishers to come up with ways to allow folks to come in and have licensed access. So the pros to licensed access is you don't have rate limits like you would find in the public APIs where the networks are going to limit the amount of data that you can get or deplete the fidelity in which you can get the data with keywords and so forth. The other pros, it's compliant with the networks. They're making this data available for the uses of analytics in these cases. And it's also going to be reliable. So you're paying a vendor, the vendor's paying the publisher. So there's a sorted out, essentially, workflow that everybody is on the same page with. And then the cons to licensed access, it's not free, right? Not all publishers have arrangements with resellers like GNIP or other partners that are going to make their data available in these types of formats. So 3 ways to get data, and different pros and cons for each. So first things I guess we should talk about is there's a lot of it. You saw on the first chart there of the landscape, there's a lot of different types of social data. Which ones are meaningful for the right job? So all data, with let's say Twitter is 140 characters of text. There could be a link, there could be a picture attached, there could be a geotag on there. So there's a lot of short, concise messages where you might go to a WordPress post could be several paragraphs long, right? So they're all going to have different sort of use cases. This is just an example of some social networks that we find to be helpful from a social media monitoring perspective. this is more kind of an overview. If we're gonna use this data to solve problems, what are some of the characteristics of the data? So this is a pretty simplified chart, but if anything, I hope it just kind of illustrates the fact that the data obviously is going to all have different content in it, but it's going to have different use cases as well. So if we're talking about some PR events and things like that, we're going to find, Twitter is going to probably break news fastest. It's short messages. Again, there's not a lot of depth and thought. Whereas if we're moving to the other side, into the WordPress, Discuss is a commenting platform on like CNN, for example. If you want to leave a comment, you'd be using Discuss. These are going to be forms of social media that are going to have a little bit more time to actually generate. Just really, I guess, touching we talked about the speed. So this would be essentially the depth of content. So it looks like we got 5 minutes. And then here essentially is these things plot out across the chart. There's some various commercial use cases for data that are, like I said, with Twitter being fast and concise, it's great for PR. If we're looking at thinking deeply about mobile devices, we may spend time in the longer form content like WordPress. So we have this data into the market. What are some things that are sort of happening basically? Well, what we also are finding that social media is growing, so we're having more users. That's generating more data. As more data exists in the market, there's going to be more value that folks will perceive to be, derived from the data. They're going to be prepared to make investments. There's more insight available, obviously, and then as these social media networks start to work more with the analytics space, there's going to be more partnerships that are going to form, so the data can actually come out and be used in more meaningful ways. Otherwise, to get the data, you have to figure out a way to work with the network directly if you're trying to perform a direct integration with them. So some of the things that we think about is if in a sort of enterprise use case or a very detailed research project that's going to use social data, we really have to think about things like completeness of the data. Are we getting all of the data? Is the data compliant? So is the data meant to be used in the way that it's actually being harvested for? Is it reliable, and is it sustainable? So if I'm starting to do a long-term project, is this data going to last? Is it going to be there for a week, or is it going to be there for years so that I can complete a long-term study? So quickly, I just want to go over sort of major event that I guess occurred in 2010 with our company, GNIP, and Twitter. Basically, Twitter realized that if we can seed the market with our data in a meaningful way, so we're going to get this sustainability, we're going to try to make it sustainable, compliant, and reliable, we can get more large analytics platforms to invest and spend time and derive insight. So this is going to basically, they're going to encourage, with GNIP, for example, we're going to encourage innovation. So we're going to do white papers and studies. That's going to go out. You're going to see tweets on TV more often. You're going to see the general public thinking about Twitter and saying things about Twitter. And that's going to basically excite the population. And at the end of the day, by making that data available in a Firehose format, for example, we're going to have more users going to the networks, right? So you're going to see this data out in your world a lot more. You know, we're doing time here. 5 minutes left. So a couple major events beyond Twitter. So I mean, this has been a successful model. We have lots of companies now and institutions coming and investing in the data. They know it's going to be there. They're doing amazing things with it. What we've been able to do at GNIP is we've actually taken the relationships and the learning, the things that we learned from Twitter, we start to talk to other social networks. So how can we take these things and talk to Discuss, for example, and Tumblr and Automatic, basically, well, we had a really clear storyline for reasons that they might want to make their data available in the same formats. So around late 2011, we announced a bunch of partnerships with Discuss commenting platform, Tumblr, Automatic, and then we're going to be providing full Firehose access. So the more mature the data partnerships, so Twitter being an example, the more things that can be done and more data products can be built for doing all kinds of different, solving all kinds of different use cases. And it allows for other things to happen. In the case, we actually partnered with Twitter and the U.S. Library of Congress, and we're making, GNIP is facilitating the delivery of all the public tweets into their archive for use in research. And it basically just research is the reserved use case there. So we have a lot of data. How are we going to tame the fire hose, and what can we do with it? Well, this will be my last slide here, I'll conclude. But the meaningful things that we're seeing about with fire hose access and licensed access is that we're going to get the whole picture of what's going on. So basically, May 10th, 2012, JP Morgan Chase announced a $2 billion trading loss. This actually there were obvious implications. You didn't need a fire hose to tell you that there's a lot of things that were happening here. But when we start to look at fire hose access data and we're recording the event, we actually see some unique characteristics of each network is going to have a different profile. So when the actual announcement happened, you can see, I know this could be really hard to read, but on the top we have Twitter. The bottom is StockTwits, which is another social network. But you saw an immediate spike. So you have this immediate discussion unfold, and then things sort of dying off pretty quickly. The next day, a lot of the blogging community is thinking about this story and what's going on, how can I weigh in on this? So you see a very slow, kind of gradual rise in the blog content that's being basically sent out. But the nice thing with the fire hose is you can actually record these profiles where when you're looking at incomplete data sets or you're not getting a full visual into the network, these profiles can be hard to lay out. So I would just kind of conclude on this. This is basically a nice example of how you can actually compare each of the publishers and their characteristics. And you can also assess the biases that each network has in a lot clearer fashion, since you kind of know what silos they live in. So that's pretty much it for me. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sherry.
The really difficult job of opening up the day. Our next speaker is Chirag Shah from Rutgers University. And we, at this full disclosure, we at the Health Media Collaboratory work with Chirag on gathering data from YouTube. So he's developed a system and put in a lot of work to understand YouTube and other platforms. So I'll let Chirag take it from there.
Thank you, Sherry.
Okay, thank you everyone. Good morning, I'm Chirag Shah. I'm at Rutgers School of Communication and Information. And I honestly don't know much about or anything about public health, so I'm not going to talk about it. I also don't know that much about big data. I don't know actually why I'm here, but since I'm here, and this is what professors do, right? No matter what, they can talk. So I'll talk anyway. This is sort of almost like a marketing talk. I put it on my title. ContextMiner is a system that we developed, and so I hope it doesn't seem like complete sales pitch. But I'll use ContextMiner, the system, as an excuse to talk about a few things. And I'll start with this big question. So remember, I don't know much about big data, right? But this is what I kind of see. Big questions behind big data, and often people have a little difficulty with the big data, and so I put this in a parenthesis: data analytics, and this is something that I'm especially interested in. So very simply, when we are talking about this big data or data analytics, what are some of the questions? Now there are a lot of questions, but for me these are sort of big questions, the 5 big questions. And it often starts with a problem, of course, right? I've also seen people just getting excited about, and sometimes we do, actually, I've done that too. We get excited about having access to some data and kind of forget about what the problem was, right? So let's say we are actually good researchers and we start with the problem. And having understood this problem or defined a problem, the question to ask is, what kind of data we should have, right? So this is just a typical research methodology. Having identified the data, where you should get the data from, well, how do you collect it, right? And this is where a lot of challenges are, and this is what specifically I'm going to focus on. The next question, having identified a way to collect this data, well, how do you know how much to collect? How much is good? How much is good enough How do you know what you're collecting is actually helping you address that problem? There are, of course, other smaller kind of questions, including how do you store it, how do you access it, how do you preserve it, and so on. Right? Let's imagine you actually manage to collect the right kind of data, right amount of data. Well, then of course it's not just about getting the data, but what does it mean, right? And so that's often a big question, which I'm not going to really talk much about, because this is an acquisition panel, so I'm going to talk more about data collection. And finally, this is something that we often kind of forget because we're so excited about big data, that, well, let's say you extracted some meaning out of it. Well, how do you verify it? How do you validate it? Just because a part of your data or whole of your data tells you something, right? Because often we are trying to model some kind of behavior through the analysis of this data, right? So just because you're learning this from this billion tweets, is it really reflecting the behavior that you're actually trying to understand? So going back to the problem. Okay. So in this talk, as I said, I'll focus mostly on the first two questions, sort of easy questions. I'll leave the harder questions for later speakers. So I'll talk a little bit about this next two questions, and as I said, I'll almost leave out the last question. The way I'll do this is using a case study, and that's where ContextMiner comes in. So I'll tell you a little bit about ContextMiner. This was back when I was a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill, and we had a group called VidArch, Video Archival. So it dealt with a different kind of big data. It didn't deal with millions and billions of data objects, but it dealt with heavy objects, sort of heavy data, right? And so we had a lot of videos that we were trying to extract things out of. We were trying to create a video digital library, and so on. Somewhere in that project, we were approached by the Library of Congress, and they expressed interest in studying this YouTube, sort of a new thing. This was back in 2005-06. And they said, well, this is kind of a new thing, and since you guys are doing video, how about you look at this this YouTube thing? And it seems that now with the primaries coming, for the presidential election, people have started actually using this. First it's kind of just started out with the funny videos and all the entertainment, music videos and stuff. But now there are some serious videos. So how about you look at it? And they were right, actually. And this is something that we now know. But back in 2006, it was sort of really a new thing. And so we also recognize this and say, okay, this is kind of a neat opportunity to use YouTube as a tool, use an election, and then let's study it. All right, so what did Library of Congress wanted us to do? Well, they also didn't have a very clear definition. They didn't have a clear problem. They just said, well, we want to create an archive of YouTube videos related to this election. We don't know exactly what it means because this hasn't been done before. You go to YouTube and just manually collect these videos. All right, well, you collect the videos, but what else can you collect? Because videos themselves may not be enough. So there are a lot of challenges, but they didn't know much about it. We didn't know much about it. And as Sherry mentioned earlier this morning, we were kind of just making things up as we were going. All right? Now, what they did, they actually gave this problem to two different organizations. They gave it to the Internet Archive, and they gave it to us at UNC. And both of us ended up using different kind of strategies. So Internet Archive did focus crawling. So what they would do, they would go to a candidate's campaign page and crawl their website to see if there are any YouTube videos, and then follow them to YouTube, and then scrape those pages. So sort of what the web crawling that they're expert in, and they kind of did this more of a focus crawling. We, on the other hand, did a very different approach, something that hadn't been done before. We said, well, YouTube itself offers searching functionality, just like other search engines. So how about we just ask YouTube that we are interested in the election-related videos? And we can even be a little bit more specific. We can say we are interested in John McCain or Barack Obama, and give us some results. And once you get the results, then collect some more data about it. Now, remember, this was back when YouTube was just YouTube. It wasn't part of Google, so it was a very different entity then. But this kind of addresses the first two questions, or rather, gives us the first two questions. The first thing is, you have a problem that you like to study. So the Library of Congress was trying to understand and archive things related about the presidential election for future generations to study and understand. And YouTube was going to be a big part of it. And then they asked us to collect it. Two organizations, two different methods. And at that time, we didn't know what would be the good and bad things about either of these methods. So we started harvesting data. We started this, in 2006. We, took some time to build a few things. We tried a few things, and then officially it started in summer of 2007. The way we did it, we went to Wikipedia, and there was a excuse me, a page about the presidential election 2008, and at that time, this was the summer of 2007. There were a lot of names. Okay, so we just collected names. We found 50 names from both Democratic and Republican side. These were possible names, people who may possibly run, right? So we just got all of those names. And then we put a few general search terms, things like presidential election 2008, decision 2008, and so on. So together we had 56 queries. We put it in this ContextMiner. And then what we did, we just put them to run automatically every day. Every day, these 56 queries will go out to YouTube, get the top 100 results, and just store it in our database. Okay? Now, every day when we do this, of course, there's going to be overlap between what you've already seen and what you're finding today. So we'll only collect the new videos. Okay? For each of the videos, we collected two kinds of data. There's static data, what we call metadata, things that don't change. So the title of the video, description, the author, duration, things like that. And then there are dynamic attributes, which were more important, more interesting to us as social scientists or computational scientists to kind of track something over a period of time, what we call context. All right, so that this was the two kinds of data. Okay. This is a little description of what exactly we collected. So for each video, there are the static attributes, as I say, the name, title, description, author, and so on. The dynamic attributes were things like view count, keeps changing, number of comments, rating, and so on. We also downloaded the actual Flash videos. And because Flash is sort of a proprietary format, we also managed to convert it into standard formats like MPEG. One of the reasons for doing this is early on we noticed that a lot of videos were disappearing. And in our experience, about 25% of YouTube videos that we at some point had seen were gone. Okay? So it was important to catch it while we could, because some of the videos would disappear within a few hours. The more controversial video, the sooner it may get flagged and disappear. But we were really interested in those videos, in addition to good videos, right? So this was YouTube. And these are some numbers after the elections. A few months after the 2008 elections were over, we had a few thousand videos. Now, this collection may seem, small compared to all the big data things you're probably going to hear today. But know that this was a curated collection. So all of these videos, we had actually gone through them, made sure that they are actually relevant, they are actually, good video at least for our project. And so these are just some numbers about them. Okay, so there are all sorts of analysis I can provide you, but I'll just give you some snapshot of what we got. And I'm not going to give you data about all the candidates that we're collecting, but just the two presidential nominees. And you can kind of, And since I'm not really an expert in political science or anything, some of the things I honestly I wouldn't be able to tell you how to read. But we did notice there was a significant amount of activity in Barack Obama's campaign compared to John McCain. Now, when I list Barack Obama and John McCain, these are not the videos that their official channel posted. These are the videos that anyone else would have posted pertaining to Barack Obama or John McCain. So these are not just the official videos. The official channel videos are part of it, but these are not all. So these numbers don't actually look that big, but because it was really the first time YouTube was being utilized in elections like this. You can also just look at the average, and you can see that Barack Obama's videos, on average, were seen 3 times more than John McCain's. Now, fast forward to 2012 elections, okay? And I'll give you some numbers for that. We haven't started analyzing this data because it's sort of still recent and things move a little slow in academia. Okay. So this is what we have, right? So significantly higher number of everything compared to the last elections, which is not surprising because after the last elections, of course, everybody knew the power of YouTube, right? So now both the candidates have very comparable, at least the videos, and but if you look at the views, there's a huge difference. Let me show you the average. So you can see the average, just look at one statistic about the average views per video, right? And you can see, now, this is very surface level picture. We can dive deeper into this and say, okay, well, what is it? Is it just one video that's causing all those views? Are there number of videos? Why are people watching these? What are they saying on those highly viewed videos and so on? So these are just some surface level statistics. Now, also, just because they show some amount of activity, that doesn't mean there is positive or negative feel with this. So that's why you kind of start digging deeper to sentiment analysis, opinion mining, and so on, which I hope there are other people talking about today. We did all sorts of analysis with this data. I'll just show you quickly a couple of things we did. One of the things we said, well, let's talk about the people, some important people in this data, right? So we came up with this kind of labels called connectors, mavens, and salesmen. So connectors, we said people who have been to a lot of videos and made some comments. So these are the people who, within our collection, going to a lot of videos and saying something, right? Mavens are people who are possibly expert or who feel very passionate about something. So they're saying a lot of things. And there are some commonality between these authors. And salesmen are people who are posting a lot of things, right? So you can see BarackObama.com was really at the top in this salesman list. And I'm not sure, I do see JohnMcCain.com is somewhere down the list. Many names after John Adverse and a number of other candidates, right? So they're just kind of, in terms of salesmanship, they were really down in the list. Another thing we've tried looking at is identifying some significant events from this data. And this is a very simple graph, actually. Wish I had a better one. But these are the kind of things we had where we can monitor, because we are collecting data every day about each of these videos, we can monitor, we can determine when something goes viral, when suddenly people start paying attention to something. So when you have things like this where you say, well, there is a sudden jump in number of comments posted on this day, something must be happening, we can immediately go and look at it. We also had this kind of interface where, because what is significant may differ from person to person, from project to project, problem to problem. So having an interface where you can define what is significant for you, when the view count changes this much percentage, when the comments change this much, right? So you get to define your own criteria. We also then realized that, well, in order to tell the whole story, not only we need to get full of YouTube, but we actually need to step out of YouTube and look at a broader picture. So I'll give you one example. So this was, I'm sorry, you can't really see this, but this is one of the videos that we collected. It's a Hillary Clinton video where you see big face of Hillary Clinton on this giant screen talking things, and somebody comes and smashes a hammer. Now, if you don't know what the context is, well, we collected in-links coming to these YouTube videos to see who's talking about it. And somewhere you find this blog about this person who actually wrote this, who created this parody. This is a parody of the 1984 Apple video, Think Different, right? And so in order to really understand, you have to step out of YouTube. And so we were able to collect this kind of data from outside of YouTube as well. All right, so since my time is kind of almost up, I'm going to give you a few pointers. The ContextMiner that we developed internally for our data collection has been available publicly for all those years. This is what it looks like. You can create your own campaign. You can set up your queries. This is a campaign about cancer research, and you can see the kind of data you can collect. Individual videos. For each video, you can, similar to what the kind of statistics that we got, you can also get automatically the views, the comments, and so on. This is a screenshot for Flickr, so you can get data from Flickr, Twitter, and so on. These are some of the tools that we've developed for collecting. These are all tools for collecting data. One of the things that we've started doing, and this is ongoing work, is collecting what YouTube is reporting insights data. Right, so the insights data, and I'm using a screenshot from this work that I've been doing with Sherry and her group. We're looking at e-cigarette, and you can see the insights data provide you information about who are the viewers of this video, where are they coming from, what is the age range, what are the significant events in terms of somebody from outside linking to this video, discovering this video, and so on. So these are the kind of data that we are collecting. This is sort of ongoing work. Also, stepping outside of YouTube, we have some work for Facebook, because often we find links from Facebook to YouTube and vice versa. And so this is one of our interfaces where we can set up campaigns similar to YouTube for Facebook. It will keep searching on Facebook, collect status updates, wall posts, and all the comments on them, and all the likes and things like that. We also have now an installable version of ContextMiner, and I was actually going to give you a demo, but I don't have time, so I'll keep that for our break. If anyone is interested, you can install this on your computer, and you can set up your YouTube queries or Facebook, and we're trying to add more sources into this. For future, we have this new NSF project called SOCRATES. It stands for Social and Crowdsourced Activities Extraction System. I always forget what it stands for, but SOCRATES. It has three major components. So there is collection component, which is what I've talked about. There is explore, and there is analyze components. And our idea is not just for us to be building this ourselves, but bring in people from academia, from industry, with their expertise, because we are not expert in all of these things. And so how do we bring people together as a community so that we can start sharing, exchanging data, methods, analysis, right? So this is kind of the main goal behind the SOCRATES project, to create that platform rather than just a tool. Okay. Just to give you an idea, this is one of our, these are all sort of ongoing work. So this is one of, I showed you the part of our collect component, which is the ContextMiner and info extractor. This is part of our explore component, which here is shown with the Twitter example, where being able to not just collect, but explore, because often you don't know what questions to ask, right? So you just start with data collection, and then as the data is coming in, you start digging into this, and that allows you to formulate your questions or queries. So this is a way to just quickly visualize incoming tweets, look into it, and then realize, oh, well, there's a lot of things going on about this. Maybe we need to dig deeper into this. All right, so with that, I'll end here. Just some links. All of these tools are, of course, available for free. Anyone can use them. If something is not working, email me. Hopefully, I'll get back to you within a few days or month, because this is academic research. So as you know, these are not commercial tools. But we do our best to keep building and supporting, especially academic research. So, and if you have any questions, come and see me during one of the breaks. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks, Shrag. The next two speakers are from the Annenberg School, Hyunsuk Kim and Tej. And they're going to talk about some really interesting work that they're doing that particularly sparked our interest because they're comparing the API, the Twitter API, with the fire codes. So there were some significant technical challenges in doing that, which I think are worth discussing a little bit. And then the conceptual issue itself, to me, is really important for all the questions that we're considering and when to use which platform.
Good morning. My name is Hyunsuk Kim and Tess. We are from Annenberg School here at Penn. So we're going to talk about our Twitter project. And before we start, we're going to thank Dr. Jose Capella and Michael Bartini and Vamsi Yallagada, who is our main programmer for this project, and Annenberg School's Systems and Infrastructure Service team and the SQL Message Core team for their support and efforts in making this project a reality. I'm going to briefly talk about the background of our project and which kind of data we are collecting, and Tess will talk about more details about how we get the data and how the data look like. And then I'm going to come back and lead a wrap-up discussion. So Twitter is, according to Twitter is a real-time information network, and currently there are more than 500 million users with more than 200 million active users. And tweet is a 140 character message posted by the Twitter. Again, this is a definition by the Twitter company itself. And there are, on average, about 400 million tweets per day posted. And the tweet looks like that, and that's the first tweet that was posted by a human, which is in 2006, March 23rd. So actually, this Thursday is the seven-year-old for birthday for the Twitter service. Okay. So accessing Twitter data. So suppose that this is the total population of all tweets posted, and we want to analyze. We want to access the data and analyze it. And I think there are two major or broad platforms. One is using Twitter certified data resellers like Tunic, DataSift, and Topsy. Currently there are three certified data resellers. We can use those venues, or we could make a direct connection to Twitter APIs, because Twitter itself is built on open source platform. So we can, if we program and we make a program, then we can directly connect to Twitter APIs, although with some limitations that Charles described in his presentation. And in terms of modes of retrieval, I think there are two broad categories. One is using some kind of filtering or searching, like filter by country, or use some keywords, and just random sampling. And our approach is, our goal in this project was to obtain a random sample of all tweets by building our own application which connects to the Twitter streaming API. And we are getting a real-time stream of tweets, and this is a random sample of about 1% of all tweets. And Tess will discuss more details about this process. And I'm going to talk more about the data fields, what kind of data we are collecting now. So first, and the best reference for this data fields, you can look at the Twitter's API documentation with very detailed explanation of what kind of data can be obtained. So in most cases, I'm basically copy and pasting their definition of what these data fields mean. And the tweet is our unit of observation, and we are also collecting and associated information about users, like screen name, and entities like URLs and hashtags embedded in the text, and places like country code. Just to give an example, I tweeted the survey, and then if you look at this data, this tweet, there is a unique ID for this tweet, and this is not shown to user interface. And I think it's the 17 or 19 digit numbers for each tweet posted. And obviously there's the actual text we are collecting and timestamp. And now we are collecting, we are converting the timestamp into Eastern Standard Time. And again, not shown to users, there is a source information, but the device, the one used for tweeting. So in my case, I use Twitter for iPhone. Okay. And again, not directly shown to users, there is a coordinate information, because I count on my location information as a Twitter collect the information about the longitude and latitude. And another kind of tweet is a kind of reply. It's called reply. So in reply to my tweet, Michelle tweeted like this. And in this case, in addition to basic tweet ID for this tweet, actual text, timestamp, source, coordinates, we can also collect the in reply to tweet ID. So the ID for that ID shown there is indicates my tweet and the screen name. So we are collecting this information. And the third kind of tweet is a retweet. So I retweeted Pew Research Center's tweet about their new annual report about news media in the US. And again, in addition to tweet ID and actual text and timestamp and source, which associate with me, we also collect whether this is a retweeted tweet and how many times this tweet has been retweeted. Okay. And next, data object concerns users. So to go back to the first example, okay. We are collecting screen name and user account. When the user account was created, this is invisible even to me. And if you click this screen name, you can see my profile page, and we are collecting how many tweets I have been posting, how many followers I have, and how many people I'm following. And also we can get the data about users' self-defined interface language, which is English in this case. And the third category is called entities. So for example, we are collecting URLs embedded in the text. And the second example is hashtag test. For example, I use hashtag like big data and coffee. And hashtag can be it's functioning like a keyword, for example. So if you click the big data part, then you can see the tweets that contain the same hashtags. And the same is true for coffee. And also we are collecting the user mentions for the screen names, like the Victor and the second screen name is the authors of the book at the OII, and the La Colombe Coffee, which is my favorite coffee shop in Philly. And about places, again, because I turned on my location information, Twitter collects my location, geographic information about the place that I tweeted. This tweet is obviously Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and country code US. And if you click this Philadelphia page, in the case I turned on the location, you can see the actual, because they collected the coordinate information. And if, for those who are living in this area, you can see where it is. Okay. And finally, we are also collecting information about the case of retweets. So say, again, back to the example where I retweeted Pew Research Center's tweet, and we are collecting unique ID for the original tweet that I retweeted, okay? And the timestamp for the original tweet. And again, if you look at the profile page, you can also collect screen name, when the Pew Research Center activate their account, and the number of tweets and followings and followers. And these are the kind of textual data and the associated metadata we have been collecting since August 2012, and Tess will talk more details about how we do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Capella and the Annenberg School for Communication for having us here and for the opportunity. Before we start diving into this, by training, I'm technology, so if I get too technical, pardon me. But I think these next few slides will address a lot of questions that were brought up by Chirag and Ganib also as to what's involved in collecting the data from get-go. So I remember the first time Hyun and Dr. Capella reached out to me May of 2012, and I went home and I never used Twitter before. So again, just never used Twitter before, and I started researching what's available on Twitter, what Twitter does, what kind of data is available, and how can I get to them. So we began the process. We started working with one of our work study. He's also a candidate here at the University of Pennsylvania doing his master's in information technology. And we started brainstorming ideas. So Twitter pretty much has 4 types of APIs available as of today. Twitter for web, a REST API, a search API, and a streaming API. And they all have different limits, especially the first 3 APIs that I mentioned. And streaming API will provide you the most amount of data that is somewhere between approximately 1% to 2%, depending on the event or what's happening out in the world. So let's talk about how we are fetching data using the streaming API. So in this case, the user, it's pretty much the system that we have here, and I'm sure all of us have heard the word magic word cloud. It's a virtualization a platform that we are using to run the servers that provides processing power and storage space. And the HTTP server, it's just a protocol that it uses to connect to the streaming connection process that provides us a real-time streaming data, and it's a random sample of probably approximately we're looking at 300 million to 400 million tweets per day. And it will parse out the data and it will return back a set of instructions, and then we will store all this data into a SQL database, and that's what we are using. And next. All right. So all the data, it's in real time and it's random 1%. That's what Twitter claims, but I find it. There are days that we end up with 1.5. There are days where we end up with less than 1%, and it actually makes sense. I was wondering that something's wrong here, the way we implemented this harvesting process. But actually, in the end, with Hyun's help, we were able to figure out and verify that what we are collecting is actually a correct amount of data, and it was amazing. So let's talk a little bit about the Annenberg system. As I mentioned, we are using the streaming API here, and we are collecting about 1%. Sometimes it goes up to 2%, and depending on the traffic that they're seeing on their end, on the Twitter data warehouse side. And they also limit sometimes, so that's very important to know. The system itself is designed to run 24/7, and it's fault tolerant, so I don't have to worry about getting 1 o'clock call or something that we stop collecting data. It sends alerts, and it's fault tolerance, and we also have a reporting that we find it very useful, and we learned along the way. Of course, we never did this type of data mining before. At least my team never had any exposure to get into this kind of big data. I mean, we dealt with a few hundred gigs, and this is getting close to a terabyte now. And the current repository, it's about 8 months old. We don't count the first 2 months while we were developing and testing. So we sort of archived those data, and currently since 1st of August, we have verified that the data that we have collected here at the school is actually really invaluable, and it continues to grow. The technology, the primary technology that we are using, it's the program itself that makes calls to the streaming API. It uses PHP programming language. And currently we are gathering about 21 fields that Human talked about in the previous slides. And all the data, once we get it, all the objects, it sort of gets stored into different tables on a daily basis. And we are using SQL Server for that. And the project is about 80% right now completed, the way I look at it. The 20% we will talk about the next, and that's some of the challenges follows what Chirag does the best right now with YouTube to sort of analyze, retrieve, extract, and share the information with the research community. So we already talked about this. We fetch roughly 3.7 million tweets on a daily basis. It ends up, so the database itself grows approximately 2 gigabit every day. Think about that. Your laptop has 256 gig if you have a nice SSD. And as of yesterday, as of March 17, we have 866 million tweets, taking up 700 plus gigs of disk space. I mean, now the challenges are sort of rising for me at least, and also for him here, who's trying to run the queries that's taking hours. And also every time we have a student or researchers, so it just, the challenges start to arise now. That's what I wanted to point out, and I would love to talk to some of you here to see what other options are available for me, because this is where I stop. It's 80% done. The 20%, which is the most important piece of this project. So this chart just gives you a quick overview of what we have collected in the past few months. So the quick summary before I pass it back to you here, the required resources, why we did this in-house. I think the quickest and the simplest answer is budget, cost involved. We were already involved and we already have a system in place, you know, why not make a use of it? We have a team of programmers, we have a team of system administrators. So we determined that from the cost budget standpoint purely, this would be done in-house, and if you do it well, I'm sure, and we are pretty confident that we'll produce really good results. So you definitely require some programmers, some systems, and definitely put a lot of effort if one of you is trying to take this idea and implement it to one of the institutions, put a lot of effort in monitoring, because monitoring will tell you whether you are continuing to fetch the data, whether Twitter had problems on their end, whether they changed something. So put a lot of emphasis on monitoring. So the next steps for me, make this resource available to research community, and Dr. Dali Carpini suggested that we would like, this was a resource internally only, a lot of our own research PIs not aware of it. So we would like to collaborate and make this invaluable data available to the rest of the community here at the school as well as outside the school. And the 20%, the last sentence will summarize that, and develop modules to access the data over the website. So you don't have to rely on me or IT guy to extract the data and do your analysis. So in the next coming 3 to 6 months, we will focus on developing some sort of interface that will allow you to gather or query the data we have and provide you with random sample, a true random sample, and also some ad hoc reports where you could have 5%, 10%, 15%, even 25% of the data that we have collected overall. All right, I'm going to pass it on to you now.
Okay, as a wrap-up discussion, I'm going to briefly discuss the strengths and weaknesses of this kind of project. And for strengths, I think it is obviously we can track trends in Twitter because we are collecting a representative sample of tweets without having to pre-specify the keywords, for example. So for example, we cannot predict the memes like Harlem Shake will be such popular before we collect the data. And we are also collecting almost all data fields that are useful for academic research. The data fields we ended up not collecting is, for example, the size of pictures, something like that. We are collecting almost all data fields potentially useful for research. And we are building up a longitudinal Twitter archive from since last August. And weakness might be we are not able to reliably detect relatively unpopular trends because we are getting 1% sample. So if the phenomenon of our interest is not that popular, we might not get reliable estimates. And we are not collecting network information that requires another access to APIs. And final point is that there's very little availability of accurate geographic information. And this is not only the case for us, and this is potentially an important issue for any studies using Twitter data. In our data, I just looked at the data last night, only 1.5% has accurate geographic information. And there's a study that user-defined location does not always match to the location that the users actually tweeted, like only 50% accurate. So I think this is potential challenge for us and for all research community. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all the speakers and just kind of summarize a couple of the takeaway points that resonated with me in thinking about the research that we do and thinking about what everybody in the room might be interested in. The single most important thing to me, I think, was each of the speakers noted, how you get the data. Really, this is such common sense, but I don't think it can be emphasized enough. How you get the data really determines what you find out of the data. So big data are really seductive, and when I think Chirag and Hyun-Suk both flashed up screenshots of examples of the data, all of a sudden we can all, the lights in our head go off and say, oh, we can ask that question, we can ask that question. But we really have to take a step back and understand, are the data that we're getting representative? Are they appropriate for the question that we're asking? And one of the things that really resonated with me about Charles's talk, and I've seen this before at the GNIP shop, is that nice graph of the depth of the content versus the timeliness of the content. And I think that is a really nice starting point for thinking about the research questions that we're interested in. And are we interested in public dialogue about something where people are really digesting something and thought leaders are setting agendas, or are we interested in instantaneous popular reactions? So that's one of the first things that we need to kind of conceptualize, that sometimes I think we get ahead of ourselves when we see, oh, all this data, it's amazing, we can ask this question, we can ask this question. But we need to take a step back and say, well, which platform is really the best platform? The other thing that I'm interested in, one of the reasons why I was so excited about Hyun-Suk and Tej's work, is we know a little bit about the API. We know that it's roughly a 1% sample. It's not as well known that there's different types of APIs and they yield different samples of data. And I think that that's really important to stress as we start to be the first people that publish using big data, is what source. Because I hear people all the time talking about, well, I use the API. Did you use the search API or did you use the streaming API? That really affects the data that you get in and in turn the information that you churn out of those data. It's still not clear to me that the 1% sample on the API is in fact a random sample. And as scientists, we care about that. If it's not random, that really affects our generalizability. So I'm really, really interested in taking that work a little bit further and comparing what you get from the fire hose with what you actually get from the API. And I think that will have implications beyond just research, but into industry. One of the things I'd like to hear a little bit more about is what you guys think about the merits and the challenges and the pitfalls of crawling versus kind of the syndicated data sources. It seemed to me like there's, like Chirag, you're collecting information from Twitter, and you're collecting a lot of the same fields, but it's a very different model than what GNIP has. And I think you illustrated with the election results, it's so interesting and I could immediately make translations to what we could do. You know, in what cases is that the best way to go about it? And certainly, in what cases does it make more sense to go for the fire hose and the syndicated data?
So we had a question, you know, this is the thing that we asked back when we were doing 2008 elections, and so we had actually Perils. There was Internet Archive, which was doing crawling. I mean, that's what their expertise, and we were doing more of the syndicated, as you say, you know, just query based. In the end, it kind of depends what you're trying to do. I would argue that the query-based approach was better, at least for us, because it gave us better control. So we didn't end up getting a lot of data. As you saw, you know, we had a few thousand videos, but we knew that they were good, they were relevant. So when you're talking about relevance, at least, you know, a few years ago, YouTube data wasn't as big, and so when we got a few thousand, that was actually good enough sample. Whereas if you do open web kind of crawling and then you just kind of following YouTube links and then you're saying if that page has anything about Barack Obama or you may end up getting a lot of noise. So it's a classic that, you know, recall versus precision kind of a decision you have to make at some point. And, you know, because we were after precision, we decided to, you know, stick with that with the query-based approach. It has limitations. So if you're trying to just build millions and billions of data objects that you're not necessarily going to go through individually, then, you know, it may help to get a fire hose, or it may help to just, you know, get open crawling. But we actually went through all those videos, so we didn't want to have a million videos with, you know, only 20,000 relevant.
Charles?
Yeah, we again, if we think about how can we sort of normalize the data collection effort, right? So we have licensed data sources, we have data that's being also made available publicly so anyone can use it. When we think about things, we have to think about them we have to think about every single use case that could be applied. Some folks may not have the capabilities to crawl, but they're very good at doing, you know, different interpretations and visualizations. So our thinking and the way that the publishers think is focusing on the compliant data that's being sent out to the community to use. When you are crawling, it's like WordPress has tolerance to crawling. Facebook, for example, or Twitter. So if your use case pushes you and you're using these methods into Facebook or Twitter, you're going to come up to problems pretty quickly with terms of service, where you're very welcome to do a lot of crawling when it comes to the traditional blog content. So from a normalized perspective, we think things a little bit more about, you know, focusing on the endpoints that the publishers are making available, so the compliancy issues are first laid at rest and you have a normalized mode of access.
So actually that's an interesting point, that if you have limited access to this APIs or calls or crawling, you're going to be careful about how much you're asking, right? And so, you know, and that was certainly the case with us back then, though we did get on YouTube's whitelist, but then YouTube became part of Google and it messed up the system. But at least in the beginning, we didn't have to worry about it. But
So
we
what's
did.
the whitelist? I'm sorry.
Oh, so they didn't block. They put us on this list where they wouldn't block us for asking too much data, and that was okay in the beginning because it was only us and some of our projects. But then when we made it public and then anyone can join and they can basically ask for data through our servers, they started kind of, you know, throttling us. But the point I was making is if you have a limit to how much you can ask, then you're certainly going to be a little careful about what it is, how you're making the request, right? Because you can't just say, in Ganesh's case, this is different. You have firehose, so you can just say, give me everything, and then I'll figure out what's good and not. But in our case, and that may be true in many academic settings where you have limited access, right? Because you're trying to use the free API access, and so then you can't afford to just say, okay, well, keep giving me everything, and then later I'll figure out how much is good. Because what if later you figure out that all the things that you got was actually not that useful. So we are kind of more careful in the beginning making the request rather than later doing. So it's a pre-processing versus post-processing kind of issue.
I think that goes, it stands true for Twitter too, because they have a blacklist and whitelist. And if third party is using your server to make requests, first they will throttle your outputs or the data you get, and then after a couple of hours, you will say that your program that basically fetching the data will time out.
I've also gotten onto blacklists for Flickr and in general for Yahoo, and then I had to make a request like, hey, look, I'm not trying to do anything bad. This is a research group, and they'll put me back on the. They'll get me out of the blacklist and have it a few times. So
and they're getting better and better with
Yeah.
Twitter. Actually, there is a newer authentication that they're rolling out as of March 19th or 20th. And that should address some of those issues, because a lot of schools, institutions, or companies, they are behind some commercial firewalls. So if you're making multiple simultaneous calls to fetch the data, they will be smart enough to realize that it's the same or cluster of the server running coming from the same IP. And they're looking into different ways of tackling that. But currently it stands true that Twitter will blacklist you, and it will stop collecting data.
Yeah, I know Devon is doing something similar, collecting a garden hose.
Yeah,
How-
somewhere
what do you
between
guys?
somewhere between the two.
So what's your experience?
Well, I've never heard whitelist, blacklist before, but we have enhanced API access, so we're granted.
Did you have to go request that?
Yeah, so we started doing this in 2010 and had requested access at that point, and so then I think as they started throttling access, we were granted that enhanced access, which means we have access to 80,000 active user accounts and 10% garden hose, not 100%, not the fire hose, but fairly sizable. So we're collecting around 30 to 40 million tweets a day, almost 10 times the sample size you're talking about. One of the things that Joe and I have talked about is the need to do a validation, comparing the 1% to the 10% to the full, to see how confident can we be in these smaller samples. The real question I had across the group is really the question of interoperability. We're all doing this stuff. We're all playing with this data in different ways, but really I think the way that we're going to be able to, incrementally build knowledge is by creating systems that are interoperable. And, one issue that occurs to me is like with GNIP working with Library of Congress, what's the framework you're going to provide? Since that's going to be such a central repository, would be helpful, I think, for people to know, to start building systems around use of the Library of Congress system once it goes online. I know tools like R are becoming pretty central to this because of Twitter R and because of other systems that are being used as interfaces. I guess I'd ask this to everybody, but starting with Charles.
Yeah, it's a lot of data, right? So there's going to be different technologies that will make it available in better ways for some folks and not others. Primarily, as our commercial product functions, latency is probably the one thing that folks will ask about the most, right? So if I'm looking to pull a year of Twitter data, there's a lot of processing power to do that. How do you make it available for someone that just is always going to be asking for 30 days of data? They're never going to want a year. So you have these different groups, so you have different use cases. And I don't think it's a problem that has been fully addressed yet. I know that the vision is there to make the data available for all sorts of different use cases, primarily in academia. But I think that there's still thought going into how do we do this, because it is a very big data challenge, and not all technologies are going to deliver the data in the speed and fidelity that people will want it. So there'll have to be a lot of agreement, but I think at the end of the day, there will be shortfalls, as probably there are now with the way that data is made available, but I think it's a step in the right direction, right?
So, just jump in there about the library. I've had a few conversations with them, and I don't think you should hold your breath for quick access to the big data. They're confused.
Well, more specifically, that's not what they're trying to do with it. So they're not thinking big data access. They're thinking, their primary motivation is Congress. So they're archiving it because Congress talks on Twitter, and that's how they got into this. But what they want to do with it is allow researchers to come in and do like targeted queries and check specific things, and they're not thinking about providing big data access to researchers at large.
I might just finish the thought. The idea that I've heard more commonly from the library is standard samples for researchers.
Right.
So in one day in the history of Twitter, 1 week in the history of Twitter, at intervals longitudinally, rather than setting up a system like GNIP has done or the public API where you create a query and run it against all 70 or 80 or 90 terabytes, which, as Carlos will tell you, is incredibly computationally intensive. So I think what researchers can expect is not unlimited access to Twitter through the library, but access to the same samples that everybody else is going to get. That'll be the first step.
Something that I've suggested at different forums on social media, big data kind of things, and probably Stu remembers this from the JITP conference. What this community is lacking, and when I say community, I'm talking in general about those working in social media, is, and Devan and I were talking about yesterday, is that common standards in terms of the data, the methods, tools. Something that community and information retrieval and natural language processing have done for a long time and really greatly benefited, right? And so there is a community called TRAC, Text Retrieval Conference, which is organized by NIST, right? And they make available this data set, relevant judgments, and tasks for anyone who wants to participate. And everybody, every group that participates works for the same task, but they all have different approaches. And then once a year they get together and discuss what their approaches were in terms of, whether it's retrieving task, it's visualization task, all of those things. So this allows people to share their results, insights, data, methods, tools, and a lot of great things have come out because of this. Something that we are struggling with. I mean, all of us are doing different things. We are all using different kind of data. There is no way to compare, validate, support, right? So it's good that we are all bringing new things and it's exciting. But at some point we have to start asking, as a community, don't we want to mature, go to the next level where these things, next time when we meet here or some other place, we're not talking about the same challenges, that we're now finding new challenges, new problems, that these things are now addressed or we know how to do them.
I think that anticipates what was next on my mind. Is it possible and is it desirable to establish some standards for reporting how you get your data and what kind of the parameters of the data collection, so that we can begin to compare studies to different studies? Because I worry that that somebody's going to say, oh, we found this about smoking on Twitter. What do you mean on Twitter? What does that mean?
Right.
Did you take a week of API? Was it the search API? Was it? So we can't even begin to have a meaningful conversation about content until we really have a level playing field about where it comes from.
So I wanted to ask probably a related question, but maybe a little bit different than that data acquisition. What I hear you all talking about at some level is how to represent the population of content that's there. But sometimes what you want to do is represent the population of users, and that obviously doesn't map on perfectly onto the content because we're only a small number of users who produce a lot of the content.
Right.
There's a highly skewed distribution of that. And in some sense, even a step beyond that, what we want to really do is generalize to public opinion. Because we want to move beyond the people who contribute necessarily to Twitter, understand how they're different to the public at large, and really talk about the public at large. So as you think about the systems for data acquisition, to what extent would they be different if the population you wanted to talk about was not the content alone, but the users,
Right.
and then particularly as go beyond the actual users to the public more generally, that in some sense this is an indicator of.
Right. We actually did look into this, as I briefly mentioned, in YouTube data. But we did the content collection first, and then within the content we looked at the authors and said, well, let's find out who are the special people. People who are saying a lot of things or posting a lot of things, or active participants, passive participants, and so on. But you're absolutely right. You can also do the other way. This actually allows us to address some important questions like, how do you identify spammers? Or salespeople, people who are just saying things because they're trying to sell something, product, idea, service. And so if you're trying to generalize, as Sherry was mentioning, how do you, if you're trying to actually talk about the behavior of the general population, you probably want to eliminate those outliers and see what, or study them in a different setting than the rest of them, because it's not everybody thinking this. It's just a few people saying this a lot of times, and then you end up thinking that a lot of people are actually thinking this way. So I think, this is a different discussion about.
Probably brands and industry are struggling with a lot of the same issues, and I'm wondering, one, Charles, if you foresee any opportunity to kind of leverage the work that we're all struggling with what industry is struggling with, and the language barrier is really a big one, I think, in figuring out where those shared interests are. But I know when I talk with you guys at GNIP, we always identify, oh, somebody's working on that. And I think that there's a lot of academics that would be very happy to be a laboratory for those issues. So one of the things that I'd like to kind of think about collectively is sharing data. There's standards, there's data sharing, because we've all got so much data that it's a huge resource, and we all have a different angle on that resource that could really be valuable if we pool it. And I think there's even more opportunities if there's some sense of public interest among the data producers to leverage opportunities for all of us.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you have, when you think about social media, you have different things going on. You have users engaging with users, like the classic would be a forum. So not necessarily interacting with content, but interacting with each other, where Twitter is a little bit of both. It's a bit of a hybrid, so you find that there's a lot of use cases because you have people distributing content, you have people interacting, and it also happens to be a very liberal data source in that there's a lot of metadata, right? We have location, so if we're going to be able to do anything, Twitter's kind of one of the main pillars of most social media monitoring efforts. But aside from all of that, you've got to, I guess, really go back a bunch of steps and what is your use case? What are you really trying to solve? Because if you're trying to identify folks that are user-based information off of a blog post, that's not going to get you anywhere. But if you're, again, trying to find some deep insight about a product, well, then that's going to be a great place. So it really comes down to use case. How are people interacting on the particular network? And at the end of the day, social data is great. I work with it every day. I like to think it can solve all kinds of problems, but the reality is it has to be compared typically with another data source. Especially, the financial community uses this data as well. They're not going to trade solely on what Twitter tells them, but they're going to take it and they're going to look at it into a big picture. So I think it's just putting it into the right context, but starting with the use case first, because there's a lot of great stuff. We hear a lot of things that leads us in different directions, but we really have to think about what are the answers, and again, as we've been talking about, what are the ways that we can get access to the data to solve them. But it's not easy, right? But
Yes, I have a couple of thoughts about building those standards and sharing data. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that terms of service of Twitter explicitly forbid sharing tweets you collected, so that's a limit. And the second thought is that digital media in general and social media in particular, it's creating two types of researchers. Those who have access to the full stream, they have to be in the data team, or Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and then you are like big content, have access to everything. And then the rest of us, or the majority, don't have access. You don't have a company where you can buy access, but you can't replicate the findings, and that's hampering community research, and they have an advantage. And so it's a business model, so it makes sense for them to have privileged access to all the data because they get the money out of that. On the other hand, it's hampering scientific work, I guess. And I'm not sure how to solve that. So I'm not sure if we as a community can do anything to solve that because it's not in our hands.
Well, we can do it, and other communities have done it because they've all encountered the same problems of you're basically taking, so in case of NIST, they took these documents from the New York Times and LA Times. These are news stories. I mean, of course, they belong to the Times, but they got the permission. So there has to be some organization that takes responsibility, some group that says, okay, well, we are going to talk to Twitter or Facebook or whatever and convince them that, look, we just we're not asking for all kind of things. We'll also anonymize and everything, but we need this data, and this is how we're going to use it. right? So it is possible, but that requires
Hasn't
somebody.
happened
It hasn't happened because it requires somebody to take that leadership, right? And then the community, so there's a catch-22, right? So I think there's definitely enough interest, and I've talked about this in many places, there's definitely enough interest from the community, but there's a lack of that leadership where somebody says, okay, well, we're going to take a sample of Twitter data, we're going to take a sample of YouTube data, talk to Google, talk to Twitter, and say, okay, well, can we use this, right? And it could be the Library of Congress, it could be one of the academic institutions, but somebody has to still do that. I see it.
So just to comment on this, it depends how much data you want, but the official Twitter suggestion and what NIST has followed and others is release all the IDs for the tweets, which you can do, and then there's a tool that will take those tweet IDs and just crawl and download all the tweets. And then you can build the data set like that, and that's perfectly fine. So it depends on how much data.
Can you just slow that down a little bit? I'm following you, but
Sure.
by the thing, my
So
fingers.
you can't share the tweets as you said.
Well, but they are tolerant about that way around it, but I'm not sure that they will change their minds in the future, right? I mean, they can always do it.
I mean, so they can change. You can change their minds and stop letting people just.
So there's a method that is sort of conventional, sort of to share tweets so that you don't break the terms of sort of you don't violate the terms of service. That's so they Twitter is tolerant of those methods. I'm not sure they will not change that policy.
So,
I mean, how are you sure?
So you never know. I mean, they might just shut down an API. Okay. So there's nothing you can do
But I
with
think we
that.
can have Twitter as one of the partners in this effort, right? So they don't have to be a third party. They could actually, because they could also benefit from this. So they could even sponsor this.
The first part was something about kings and queens and data and everybody else's peons. This has forever been true in academia. If you write good grant proposals, you will have better tools, you will have better data, and everybody else will look like a peon next to you because that's a meritocracy for how research is done. Having said that,
Spoken like an entrepreneur.
spoken like an academic who wrote innocent transfer papers. And the fact that we always had data and the fact that we could build tools and we could have research assistants forever set us apart from other people. In fact, engendered a lot of resentment amongst peers that we could do all these things. We could do almost anything we wanted. And that's one of the things about the system I don't think we can change despite whatever concerns we have. In terms of replication, there are all sorts of tools now available for creating replication opportunities. Open source free tools, web-based tools, commercial tools. I think the possibility for replication in social media is far greater than anything that existed on interviews and surveys in the past, because IRBs traditionally tied their hands from secondary uses of these data, especially when there was sensitive information in it that allowed the identification of participants. So these are people putting public comments into the public sphere. And these are researchers who are writing grants so they can more accurately and efficiently and effectively do research with that data. I don't think there's an ethical dilemma there. Maybe, I agree with Chirag, there does need to be institutional leadership to create the samples that allow people to replicate the findings. But I guarantee you, if you want to replicate some of what Sherry is doing in her group, we can help you create a concrete opportunity for replication that doesn't require us giving you all the tweets.
Another point I want
Hyun-Suk and then Devon.
to make in relation to the issue of data sharing and standard and research is that one important recent change with Twitter is that for the streaming API data we are collecting, so for example, the researchers get always the same data. So we are running our application to get this data via streaming API using the sampling method. And the one, for example, using the same API, and we are getting exactly the same data. And I think this is an important issue because the part of the regions that research has shown some mixed effect, mixed result would be they use their own methods of coding the data using different set of search terms, which can be potentially biased, but there is no way to test whether how much bias it is, in what ways it is biased. So I think and using this standard data with both the common data set to all research communities or the business partners, I think that might be a future opportunity to cross-validate the results that are produced by researchers and business.
Devon?
I was just going to suggest that Twitter itself, I think, has really been good about inviting academics in for helping them think through some of their issues. And the one who I know is most prominent there is Jimmy Lin, who's I think, social professor at University of Maryland, and then took a leave of absence to go work at Twitter. I don't know if he's still there.
Yeah, he's a good friend. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
still, yeah.
And so he's, and he's been great about trying to find ways for academics to work with Twitter and vice versa. And a lot of this is happening at ICWSM, the International Conference of Weblogs and Social Media. But he was a keynote speaker at the Barcelona conference. Then they were in Dublin. This year they'll be in Boston. But it's a great conference for seeing this interface emerging and starting to talk about some kind of shared platforms, data harmonization, these kinds of issues. So just for those who are interested in that, Jimmy Lin would be a great person to start to contact him if sharing's important. 1 degree of separation.
Yeah, let's put that in the meeting notes somewhere, because I'd like to remember that. Glenn?
I have like a what's next in social media question, so I'll direct this towards Charles. I was at South by Southwest Interactive, and a big talk amongst the marketing industry is Tumblr. So can you talk about that platform, demographics around it, what's shared on Tumblr, and why it's significant, and kind of compare it to Twitter?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Tumblr has following a lot of, in some ways, some of the footsteps is Twitter, right? So they're realizing if we seed the market with our data in a meaningful way, again, it's not quite, economics have lined up to where there's a lot of ways that it can be made available for free necessarily, but people can come start to work with it and understand it. And before this was actually occurring, no one really knew what was going on in Tumblr. Tumblr kind of hides a lot of the internal statistics in terms of how many people are following or how viral a meme may go. So a lot of the understanding of Tumblr is still kind of unfolding as we speak. So, but Tumblr is interesting in that it allows people to come in and utilize a blog type of platform in a very convenient way. So not typing out a whole blog post, you can really share the content. So it's very similar to a retweet. But Tumblr is focused or has gotten a lot of traction with young people that want to go and talk about pop culture and things like that. So it's picked up a lot of traction in that demographic. People like it as an alternative to Facebook because it's still open, but it's still rich in content. Tumblr's also good about slicing the content up. So if I'm looking for just audio activities, or I'm looking for just pictures, which Tumblr's a lot of pictures, or I'm looking for text, I can kind of slice the content up a little bit more. But it's a very interesting ecosystem there, and it's meant around visual, so which is also to what's next in social media. I think we're going to find that people don't want to sit there and type out a blog post or a tweet. They would rather just take a picture, for example, of this room, and it's pretty clear sort of what's going on. So Tumblr is really aligning with the new forms of communication that I think social media is going, and they're making the sharing the content very easy, and they're bringing the data into the marketplace, at least on the commercial side, so people can go in and deeply understand how these things are going, right? So I think it's an amazing network, and I think the potential is just being scratched. And we're really excited about some of the things we've already seen happen. So.
Cool. Emily, I think had her hand up a long time ago. And we've got 2 minutes to wrap this up too, so not to rush you.
Sure, my question might be really naive, but in terms of Devon's point that there are people who are academics within who are employed by Twitter or who consult with Twitter, and then there's an interest in making it useful in certain ways that are potentially financially profitable or beneficial to society as a whole. Like, somebody knows how this works, right? Somebody has programmed all of the various access points that we're looking at. So somebody knows the answers to these questions. And I guess my potentially naive question was, what would be the downside in having that information be available? Is this a random sample, for example? I don't know who would be even the most appropriate person to answer that, but for folks who are more experienced interfacing with the corporate side of it, why not tell academics that?
So the networks, their main challenge, or what they're trying to do at the end of the day, besides seed the market with their data for academic use cases or commercial is a little bit different, but they're trying to grow. Like, they're trying to generate revenue. So they have bottom lines to hit. So they're focusing on those things. So, and their networks are moving really quickly, right? Their demographics are changing. They're becoming unpopular all of a sudden, or they're having privacy issues. So they're fighting all these battles trying to keep things sustainable. And where they found the best alignment in a commercial sense is because if they can make the data available in a meaningful way, and people can actually invest and build on it for the long term, as I guess what I was speaking about earlier, then that'll bring more users in. So they're seeing the really good traction with, kind of the sustainability model. So letting the big brands use the data, talk about it on TV, talk about the network on TV, and that drives users. So I mean, that's the first thing. But I mean, to answer your question, how do you make it available for everybody and still keep that sort of
No, sorry, my question isn't how do you make the data available? The question is how do you, why not tell academics or anybody who's asking whether, for example, the streaming API is a random sample of tweets, or whether, the garden hose is a random sample of tweets, right? That's a sort of yes/no question.
The stated assumption is that it is, but it hasn't been verified. I think that's the question that
So
Jeremy.
they may not even know themselves, and I
It's not
think
easy.
part of it's the,
It'd be hard to
how to get
randomize
it.
that stream.
So when I asked Twitter, they said it was randomized based on hashing the tweet ID.
Okay.
So, and then they said, if you have a better randomization scheme, let us know.
And it's actually, yeah.
Sounds good. I mean, I don't know how they're assigning the tweet IDs. That might be part of it.
So
but-
you saw the 19 digit numbers that I showed, like the unique ID for each tweet. So they kind of give us a 1% sample based on that number.
And it's not easy, right? Again, there's social gestures like votes, there's blog posts, comments, tweets. So you have all this vast array of different types of content. So is a 1% sample of comments helpful, or is not? You need 10% of a comment or 1% of a tweet. So it's, and then you have to, again, you have these moving dynamics in the network. They've got to take time to go, interface and figure out, with the community, what's the appropriate amounts. And I think it's just a really challenging problem. It comes down to normalization. How do you define it and bucket it out in equal ways?
Right. I think we're trying to stay on time, and I'm not doing as well as I could. But to summarize, I think that really this question and your answer, Charles, really points to the imperative to establish standards of reporting. So even if we don't know exactly, do we need a random sample of the tweet IDs or the content or various, we need to develop standards of reporting and analysis that incorporate letting people know how you're getting the data and what the implications are for the findings. So I think we'll continue this part of the conversation throughout the day. Let's take a 12-minute break and come back for the session on it.